By the late 1870s, Indian Territory had developed a rhythm that outsiders rarely noticed until it was too late. The land looked open, but it wasn't unguarded. It was watched by marshals who rode fixed routes, by ranchers who counted cattle by habit, by towns that learned when to look away and when not to ask questions. Law existed here, but it moved unevenly. Jurisdiction shifted from mile to mile. Authority changed hands without warning. People who lived there learned to read that rhythm. So did the people who lived outside it. Shah Kanga, known to white newspapers as Blue Duck, was one of the men who learned where the pattern thinned. No one recorded the moment he decided to become an outlaw. There is no turning point preserved in ink. What survives instead are fragments, names listed together in affidavits, witnesses describing a Cherokee man riding with known thieves, arrests that came too late to stop the damage. That absence matters. It tells you this wasn't a story of rebellion or ambition. It was a story of drift. By the time Blue Duck's name began appearing in official records, he was already moving with men who understood cattle the way merchants understand inventory. Herds passed north through the Cherokee Nation regularly. Some were legitimate, some were not. Brands could be altered, paperwork could be delayed. A herd that crossed the wrong line at the right time might belong to someone else by morning. Blue Duck rode with groups that knew where to wait and when to move. They avoided towns when possible. They split herds before daylight. They sold through intermediaries who never asked questions because questions slowed business. When violence happened, and it did, it wasn't dramatic. It was fast, close, and finished before anyone could assemble a response. The newspapers called these men marauders. That word suggests frenzy. What they practiced was patience. Indian Territory after the Civil War produced many men like this. Former soldiers, displaced farmers, freedmen without protection, native men pushed between federal authority and tribal law, accountable to both and protected by neither. Crime didn't feel like defiance here. It felt like alignment, moving with the way power actually worked. By the early 1880s, Blue Duck's name traveled in familiar company. Men already known to marshals, men whose arrests appeared in the Fort Smith court docket, men who would later die resisting arrest or vanish quietly. He wasn't a rumor attached after the fact. Witnesses placed him at robberies. Victims described him. Lawmen looked for him. That was how his name came to overlap with Belle Starr's. Belle Starr did not run with outlaws the way stories later suggested. She anchored them. Her place near the Canadian River wasn't a hideout so much as a junction. Horses arrived and left. Men stayed a night or a week. Guns were traded. Information moved faster there than anywhere else in the territory. Federal marshals knew this. They raided her repeatedly. They arrested her more than once. She was tried, she was convicted, she served time. These are not embellishments. They are court records. Blue Duck's connection to her was practical. He moved in the same network, rode with men who passed through her land, shared the same supply routes and safe gaps between patrols. When newspapers tied his name to hers, it wasn't because it made good copy. It was because the same witnesses kept repeating the same associations. Criminal ecosystems leave patterns. Belle Starr's farm sat at the center of one. Violence followed inevitably. Some robberies went clean, others did not. Blue Duck's group was linked to killings, some during thefts, others during pursuit. The details differ depending on the source, but the structure stays consistent. An armed group, resisting capture, making decisions under pressure. White newspapers seized on Blue Duck's identity eagerly. A Cherokee outlaw fit a narrative federal authorities found useful. Crime could be framed as cultural failure instead of structural neglect. It allowed punishment to feel corrective rather than convenient. But the legal system didn't deal in narrative. It dealt in custody. When Blue Duck was captured, he was processed like any other defendant destined for Fort Smith. There was no spectacle at first. He was restrained. He was transported. He stood trial. Witnesses spoke. The charges were specific. Names were named. Locations fixed. That detail matters. Photographs are taken of people expected to be remembered by the system, not by legend. It is an administrative act. It means the government intended to close the loop. There was no rescue attempt, no delay that changed the outcome. The execution was public, efficient, and briefly covered. The newspapers moved on quickly. Another outlaw removed, another warning issued. Belle Starr would die later, shot from behind on a lonely road. Her murder was never solved. Speculation replaced evidence. Her fame expanded after death, fed by mystery. His name slipped into footnotes or hardened into caricature, depending on who was speaking. The records remained, but the story thinned. He became useful as a symbol and disposable as a person. Blue Duck was not a folk villain invented by rumor. He was not a hero crushed by injustice. He was a participant in a criminal economy that flourished where authority fractured. His association with Belle Starr does not elevate him into legend. It anchors him in documentation. He lived where law moved slowly, where patterns mattered more than rules, and where survival often required choosing the path that already existed instead of imagining a new one. Indian Territory would eventually dissolve into Oklahoma. Statehood would arrive. Railroads would settle into permanence. Courts would gain consistency. But none of that happened because men like Blue Duck were stopped. It happened because the system they exploited finally learned how to move faster than habit.